Hello, this is Matt Pullin, and I'm going to show you a tournament game I played this weekend in the Illinois Open against a Grandmaster. This tournament I lost my first two games, so I withdrew and I re-entered the two-day schedule. And from that point on, I played very well. My first round I drew against an expert who's almost 2200. And in the round after that, I was paired against a 2600 Nikolai Mitkov, and he's a Grandmaster, and I was white, and I played my English. And at this point in the game, he surprised me by playing a move that is his own special creation. Usually black would play either f5, which leads to a reversed Grand Prix, or he'd play knight to f6, which is a two-knight system. But he plays knight g to e7, which is a move that I had never seen before. My book on the dynamic English does not cover this. So I had to make up, my own opening path from here. But I think I responded quite well. So I played a3, and he plays a6, and I play e3, putting my pawns on dark squares to try to limit the bishop on c5. And he plays bishop a7, a move he's going to have to play eventually anyway, because I'm going to play either b4 or d4 in this opening. So I play b3. I don't really like to play b4. It gains more space on the queen side, but it weakens my c4 pawn. So I'm content just to play b3, with the idea of playing pawn to d4 later. He castled. I play bishop to b2, d6, d3, bishop e6. Now, in the dynamic English, when bishop to e6 is played, it's time for knight to d5. And in this position, especially with the knight on e7, it makes sense. Because if bishop takes knight, pawn takes, this knight cannot drop back to e7. He's got to go to b8. And now I've got the bishop pair and this strong pawn on d5, and I can move my rook over and get on the half-open c-file and pressure his c7 pawn. And knight takes knight is just a blunder because pawn takes forks these two pieces. So he plays queen to d7, and in this position I was reluctant to develop my kingside knight. Knight to e2 is the most natural move. But I want to know if he's going to play f5. If he's going to play f5, then I want my knight to go to h3, so that I can play pawn to f4. So I want to wait on developing this piece. So instead I play my rook to c1. And this is a prophylactic move. If he ever captures on d5, then my rook is going to be on the half-open c-file and pressure his pawn on c7. Also, there are maneuvers with this rook on c1. I can go to c2, and then swing my rook over to e2 to get on the central file, and maybe bring my queen over to a1 to get on the long diagonal. So rook to c1 is a very flexible move, which is why I decided to play it instead of developing my kingside. I guess developing the kingside with knight to e2 would be better fundamental chess, but I felt rook c1 was best in this position. So he plays, I think I screwed up that move. He plays knight to d8 here. And the idea is he wants to play c6 and d5, kicking this knight back. So I played pawn to d4, the justification being if he's going to move this knight that has good control over e5 and d4 away from the center, then pawn to d4 has to be played to take advantage of that. And right now I'm actually threatening to play pawn takes pawn. So c6 is not a threat for him yet because I can just trade on e7. So he goes knight to g6 to avoid this trade, and now he's threatening to play c6. And also he's protecting his e5 pawn. So I play pawn to h4 to take advantage of the knight on g6, and he can't block me with h5 because my queen is open to take the h5 pawn. So in this position, I'm threatening h5, and he plays c6, which I think is very curious that he decided to go into this. Usually when you're playing someone much lower rated than you want to avoid complications and go for simple positions. And the weaker player is supposed to introduce the complications, because the complications give the weaker player a best chance of winning. So I play h5, which is pretty much forced, and he captures, and I capture on g6, and now he plays a move that surprises me. He should play f takes g, which opens up his f-file, but he captured on d4, and this is very, very strange that he allows me to use the h-file. Now in this position I sort of psyched myself out. Rook takes is definitely the best move in the position, but I was afraid to play it because I thought that he had a line that he had calculated that's better for him. You know, and part of that is psychology. I mean, why would a grandmaster allow me to play this unless he had something prepared? So I was concerned with two moves. I was concerned with pawn takes, because then my rook has to go back to h1, and then after pawn takes pawn. But I did not see that I could play f4 here, which stops his attack on f2. And now, after I move my bishop and play rook c2 to h2 and then come crashing down on the h-file, this has to be better for me. So I was afraid of going into this, and I should not have been. Also, he has this move, bishop to g4, and I looked at one queen sacrifice against this. I looked at the queen sacrifice bishop takes, rook takes, with the idea of threatening rook takes d4. But knight to e6 stops all of this stuff. So the queen sacrifice is not sound. But there's a better queen sacrifice here, bishop takes. Because now, if he takes the queen, this is mate. So bishop to g4 was not dangerous at all. I should have played rook takes without a doubt. But I doubted myself in this position, and I played queen to h5, which is very inferior. My idea here, he's forced to play h6, and I played knight h3. My idea here is to sacrifice the knight on g5. But I simply didn't calculate far enough, and my knight never gets to sacrifice itself. So he captured on g6, and I took, and he played rook to f6, and now I brought the queen back to b1, and from this point out, every single move my position gets worse. He, after queen to b1, he trades on c4, and now he plays bishop to f5 to get my queen off of this diagonal, and I go to a1 to get on the long diagonal, which turns out to be completely useless. He brings his knight into the game, c6, and I brought my knight into the game to f4, and he plays his rook to e8. And now I castled, but I didn't see what else to do here. I mean, he's got so much pressure on the e-file that I might just be losing in this position. So I castled, which definitely is bad for white. And he plays bishop to e4 to trade off my defender. And I didn't like this position at all. I tried bishop to h3, and then he brings his queen over on the f-file. And in this position, this is very miserable. I played my queen to a2, not sure why, and he brought his knight into e5. And I resigned in this position because knight to f3 check is going to be fatal. So notice in this position, all of his pieces are functional. He's got the bishop, the knight on the e4 and e5. He's got his rooks in the best positions, and the bishop on a7 is even putting pressure on my diagonal. So just that one inaccurate move, queen to h5, allowed my grandmaster opponent to fully take advantage of his initiative on the king side. So yeah, I should have gone for the complications with rook takes h7, and I'm not sure why I didn't. I had the whole world against me psychologically, seeing as my opponent was a grandmaster. But yeah, that was my game against Nikolai Mitkov. I certainly got crushed, but I played the opening pretty well, and I could have had a very beneficial tactical position. And I will show you my later games from this event in future videos. Hope you enjoyed.